Go in the description, subscribe to the New Testament Review podcast with Ian Mills and Laura Robinson. Ian Mills, thanks for inviting me.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. So for my audience on Mythvision podcast, I'm interested in getting an initial show with you, just discussing your background, some of the research you've done, what you've studied, in a sense, like what your focus is, where you work, obviously is involved in this, and just give us some information about yourself so my audience can know who you are and where you're coming from and the insight you might bring.
Awesome. My name is Ian Mills. I'm a PhD candidate at Duke University in the religion department with a specialization in New Testament and early Christianity. I'm also a visiting professor at Elon University this semester, teaching their early Christian literature in context course. I also teach Greek in the Divinity School at Duke. My undergraduate training was at the University of Minnesota. I studied classics, first and foremost, Greek and Latin literature, as well as biblical studies, religious studies, and I was a philosophy major until I got demoted to a minor because of a funny technicality. I did a master's in religion at Duke. I've taught middle school and high school Latin, and I'm currently writing my dissertation on 2nd century Gospels and what that can tell us about the nature of Gospel literature. I've published on the reception of New Testament works in the 2nd century, as well as the continuing writing of Christian scripture from the 1st into the 2nd century.
Interesting. There's so much there that we're going to end up having to get into, and I plan to do many more visits, if you will, to try and get some of this stuff unearthed out of your mind. Because we've talked before, and I've watched you, and I want our audience to know you have a YouTube channel. What's the name of your YouTube?
So Laura Robinson and I, Laura is my Dr. Schwester here at Duke, we run a podcast called the New Testament Review podcast. We've on our 36th episode now, I think, where we review influential works of New Testament scholarship. We contextualize them in the history of the field and discuss their reception in New Testament scholarship. We have recently, like you said, launched into starting to make YouTube videos. And these are, I've recorded a few of my lectures that I've given in my course. And we have started doing a non-canonical Bible study, where once a month, Laura and I read some non-canonical Christian or Jewish text that's relevant for understanding the New Testament. And we sort of contextualize that, discuss it, we read a little bit of scholarship, and do about an hour-long discussion of that. So our first episode was on the Ascension of Isaiah, and we talked about how that is receiving Christian traditions, reflecting certain Christian traditions that show up inside the New Testament, and then inform later Christian ways of thinking about all sorts of things, about prophecy, about the New Testament, about heaven. So
that's very interesting that you guys have done this. I'm glad the scholarship is being available for free for people. I mean, there's books and there's always stuff out there, but you know how today people watch media, they want to hear it or they want to see it. And so reading is difficult for some people these days.
I'm aware of that.
Yeah, like your recent video just now, the Bible is the Bible true? And then you have to break down what this means. And someone commented in your video was like, seems like someone's getting under your skin about something, like there's a pet peeve or something.
Well, can I tell you where that comes from? We see people commenting on our YouTube videos where we're discussing the social situation underlying the Gospel of John, or we're talking about the view of women reflected in 1 Corinthians. We get people commenting on our New Testament channel, the Bible is all fiction, the Bible is all myth, the Bible is all, none of the Bible is true. As if, and then on the other side, we get, of course, Christian apologists coming on and saying, the Bible is truth and this is all historical, as if it's a dichotomy, as if it's an either-or question, and as if historians ask that question, as if the only way that a source could be interesting for historians or useful is that it's either true or false. But that's not how historians work, and that's not even how faith communities work. I can section off that ladder for a second here, but historians don't come to Homer and just ask, is this true or false? They look at this as a source for sure. What happened in the purported time it's talking about. For it does in fact tell us information about probably pre-Greek, the Mycenaean wars, the conflicts that happened in the time it's talking about. It is not a transcript of the speeches that Menelaus was giving. At the same time, historians use it to talk about the time in which the Iliad was being composed. And it reflects all sorts of stuff about storytelling and things like that. The same is true of the New Testament. It is almost meaningless to ask. I mean, I don't even know what it means to ask whether Paul's letter to Philemon is true. It does tell us a whole lot about ancient slavery. It does tell us a lot about ancient epistolography. And that's how historians use sources. And likewise, of course, there are things in the Gospel of John. I don't think any historian believes the Gospel of John is a transcript of what Jesus said. That doesn't mean that John doesn't tell us anything about the historical Jesus, and that doesn't mean John doesn't tell us lots of very interesting things about how the historical Jesus was remembered and how he was used by the 1st and 2nd century church.
I think that's important. I get a lot of those comments as well. I don't spend all day, responding. I see it in the past. If it's something that I favor, I'll hit a heart on it and move on. But it's nothing against anyone that I don't heart. It's just I don't think I have the time to go through and spell that out personally. I've, like some people who think the entire New Testament is complete fictional in astrotheology, for example. It's like there might be something there, like a hint of astrology or something that might be ingrained into the narrative. However, you're going like it's either or, and I get what you're saying. So I really am fascinated so far, even just hearing you spout this off. You can tell that you're educated. You're inside of academic circles when you discuss this, which I really am glad that you're coming on to share your views and insight with my audience as well, because we hear from people. We hear from Dr. Price. We hear from Dr. Richard Carrier, who's come on. And they are fringe in terms of the academic circles that you are involved in. However, they very, very kind people that I've dealt with. I know that Richard has maybe offended some people, but that's a different topic for a different day. I really have a very good relationship with these guys. I also have good relationships with guys who are mainstream. And I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, in the topic of your background, maybe just briefly, because this is kind of hit point on my channel. It'd be different if I was interviewing you on just a mainstream scholarship channel. But because we have focused so much on mythology and so much on mythicism, why isn't that in the mainstream circle? Is that a big question? Should we? Why
isn't mythicism mainstream?
Yeah, why is it not even a thing discussed in scholarship?
Well, it's complicated answers to this. One thing I want to note sort of preliminarily is that Robert Price's scholarship isn't just fringe because he denies the historical Jesus. The whole clusters of beliefs, these other things he believes around that in order to make his case, are all also fringe. His view of Gnosticism, the origins of Gnosticism. There are lots of amazing scholars working at public universities around the country who are primarily interested in the development of the groups of religions we call Gnosticism, these different sects, which were not a unified, holistic belief system that get called by their opponents Gnostics. I think of Jeffrey Smith at the University of Texas and all sorts of folks. I don't need to list them off. Zlatko Plesha at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. These scholars dedicate their life to working and studying these texts. And many of them have little to no interest in the historical Jesus. They're not concerned with that project. Some of them would even probably dismiss that project as not being one that they can say much, that they think there's much that can be said about. The views Price and others, including Richard Carrier, holds about the origins of Gnosticism, the development of Gnosticism, where they date that literature, how they break up that literature in terms of source criticism, are also fringe. And so the point I'm making is it isn't just that someone denies the historicity of Jesus that puts them on the fringe. To deny the historicity of Jesus, they have adopted fringe positions on all sorts of other issues. Just to take another example, Price sides with the Dutch radicals on the authenticity of the Pauline corpus. And there are lots of people who dedicate their lives to studying Paul and to studying ancient epistolography and to studying the theology of Paul in Romans or the ecclesiology of Paul in 1 Corinthians. And there are no other scholars living right now, as far as I'm aware, that hold any view that's even remotely similar to Price. And a lot of these scholars have little to no interest in historical Jesus questions. Some of the Pauline scholars at Duke that I work with think historical Jesus studies is just it's something that they have no interest in talking about and don't spend much time. It's not what they're invested in. And a lot of these people aren't, there are lots of Pauline scholars who aren't practicing Christians. E.P. Sanders, I'm not sure he wasn't a practicing Christian, but he certainly was not invested in a theological project. And on this issue too, mythicist scholars have to adopt some radically fringe positions, some absolutely idiosyncratic positions. And so why is it that there aren't mythicist scholars is because to be a mythicist scholar, you need to adopt a whole host of absolutely fringe positions that the people who dedicate their lives to those things don't consider serious. You need to find a way to make the brother in Galatians 1, where it's being used, James is called the brother of Christ, to distinguish him from the other apostles, to distinguish him from the leaders of the church. You need to find a way to make that some sort of formal title that doesn't refer to the normal use of adelphos. It goes on and on and on. Robert Price speculates some interpolation in 1 Corinthians 15, for which we have no textual evidence, and which isn't justified by an internal reading of 1 Corinthians. That is to get rid of the Eucharistic formula situated in the historical life of Jesus. And they often justify this by saying, writing history is just sort of a Gestalt project. You just adopt the view that makes sense of all the data for you. And of course, there's something, more or less right about that. There's something true to that, in that we are doing abductive inference. We're coming up with theories that explain most of the data while adhering to a certain, number of explanatory virtues like parsimony and things like that. But doing history doesn't have to be done most people don't do history as one overarching giant theory. You can ask interesting questions about how are we going to date the ascension of Isaiah, and you can isolate that and just say what information do we have that pertains to this question? And when you do that, you find that a lot of the subsidiary theories that undergird mythicist interpretations of the New Testament are not the best explanation for the evidence. That he's adopting all these positions in order to support this big overarching theory that also, of course, is fringe.
So that we're fair, I don't want us to just jab the mythicists, because a lot of my friends, and even Dr. Price, he wants to adopt me. He loves me. He's like, yeah, I'm getting the papers written up, and he is a very kind man. I really do appreciate him. And so that we're fair and we're jabbing at views here, it's obvious, and not in a negative way. You're saying, look, guys, I'm not convinced there's good reason to be doubtful of this position. Let's poke a little bit at Dr. Ehrman,
sure,
the nemesis mythicist will say.
That's a strange position to adopt. To make Ehrman your nemesis Ehrman is such a mainstream sort of conservative for the views in the 1980s position, who thinks that the historical Jesus isn't the same figure as he's presented in the Gospels. I'm happy to discuss Professor Ehrman's work in a second here, but if you want me to be totally fair, our podcast made waves, made splashes, first got noticed because we were criticizing Christian apologists. We did an episode where we tore Lee Strobel's Case for Christ book apart. We are not invested in doing apologetics in support of some fundamentalist, inerrantist view of Scripture. We're interested in doing the best historical work we can, and our object of inquiry happens to be the New Testament. But yes, on Professor Ehrman. Professor Ehrman, I've had the absolute pleasure of working with, studying under, I should say. I've taken several courses with him. I've done directed studies with him back when I was in coursework. He's on my dissertation committee. I speak with him, fairly regularly as I'm doing my research. He's read drafts of everything I've published. But to your point, I think Professor Ehrman, the dark secret about Dr. Ehrman is that he's a conservative. People, not a political conservative, mind you, but people, portray him as this, especially people on the right, conservative scholarships, portray him as this radical skeptic who has outlying views on everything in the New Testament and is, is ridiculously skeptical about the Gospels. And this isn't true. Professor Ehrman studied under Bruce Metzger at Princeton Theological Seminary, and except for the views that he's published, major scholarly monographs on, as far as I can tell, he pretty much holds more or less all the same views that were mainstream in the 1980s. The views he learned from Bruce Metzger. In a lot of ways, I think Ehrman represents a sort of conservative vein in the field. His views on Paul, how to read justification in Romans, I think line up more with sort of pre-New Perspective views. He, of course, has incorporated some of E.B. Sanders' very valuable insights, but line up with relatively conservative views on how to read Paul, his views on source criticism. I mean, he's a two-source theorist. In fact, he's more than that. He's a four-source theorist, which is even less mainstream among Q believers today. He thinks there's an M and an L document that Matthew and Luke used. And that, again, I think just reflects a sort of 1980s view of things. On textual criticism, I mean, of course, he's made major contributions into the use of patristic sources, patristic quotations, for reconstructing the text of the New Testament. But his views on, say, the CBGM, which is this new method of doing textual criticism, his views on the reconstructibility of autographs, things like or reconstructibility of initial texts, I should say. A lot of his views on relative to what we're calling like new philology or material philology are very much conservative views. They're the views that were mainstream, held by people, evangelical scholars like Bruce Metzger and Michael Holmes in the 1980s. And I want to say that this isn't meant as a criticism. It is incredibly valuable to have someone who holds mainstream views that are not especially controversial, who is writing for public audiences. And he's done an amazing job at that. And this has irritated a lot of people who are conservative Christians, because the fact is that the views that pastors are learning at mainstream seminaries all over the country are not leaving those seminary doors. There have been scholars who've done studies of this. The views that they get taught in seminaries and they adopt in seminaries and they write papers on in seminaries, they go preach to their congregation as if they'd never heard of those things. And I think this is why Ehrman has become so controversial, is because he is making public the views that all of these pastors learned at their seminaries, but aren't teaching their congregations. And the congregations, of course, I think, and understandably so, are shocked to learn that even most evangelical scholars don't think Paul wrote all 13 letters. And their pastors are learning this in seminary and not telling their congregations this. And I think this is why there's been such a strong apologetic reaction to Professor Ehrman. So I say let his number increase, even though Ehrman and I hold very different views on a whole host of issues.